Okay. Well, the goal, like I mentioned last time, this is the goal for the class today, that we'll all be able to clearly and concisely explain any part of the purchase contract to our client in easy to understand language. The whole point is that, in fact, Holly mentioned this at a recent meeting, broker meeting, that we absolutely have the obligation to explain to our clients what every aspect of this contract means. And so what I've done is I've created basically, I've just written down the language that I would use to explain what every clause of the contract means, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. In fact, the top box you'll see here is going to be an actual clip of the actual contract language, and the bottom box below is going to be the words that I recommend you use to describe paragraphs and sections of the contract. So we're going to start with this disclosure because that's where we left off last time, on lines 154 through 156. And another thing, this is written.
Mark, can you let Kelly in? And she's in the waiting room.
Oh,
sorry.
Gosh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
It's I'm just not used to that.
Thanks.
You bet. Okay. Kelly, if you can hear me, welcome. Sorry I kept you waiting there. I forgot to disable the waiting room this morning. So anyway, this language is in the assumption that we are explaining this to the buyer at the time the contract is being written or reviewed for signatures. That's just the way I wrote it. The concepts could apply just as well if you're describing it to the seller. So under disclosure, the seller property disclosure statement, I would say to the quick explanation there is if we haven't received it already, the seller has 3 days to provide you with a completed seller property disclosure statement. And if the seller's agent did their job the way they're supposed to, we do already have it because it had been uploaded to the MLS. The next section, insurance claims history, the way I explain that briefly is I just say the seller has 5 days to provide you an insurance claims history describing any insurance claims they've made, if any, going back at least 5 years or the entire time they've owned the property, if less than 5 years. Okay, next slide. Where's my tools? My apologies, I'm missing my tools.
While you're thinking about that, Mark, one of the ways that I remember that, guys, is that you have the SPUDS, which is the seller property disclosure statement. The seller has 3 days to get that to the buyer after an executed contract. And the claims history is 5 days. So the way I've always remembered it is claims history comes from a big corporation or an entity. It's a company. So there's a little bit more bureaucracy. And that's how I remember it between the 3 and the 5 days.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Jeff. Thanks for clarifying that. Okay. Well, next slide. Section 4C, foreign sellers. The way I describe this is the seller is required to disclose if they are not a U.S. citizen and submit paperwork to that effect to the escrow company. Foreign sellers may be subject to a tax up to 15% on the proceeds of the sale. Paragraph 6N explains how this may affect you, the buyer, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And we'll get into more detail there. That is FERPTA. Okay, the next section is the lead-based paint disclosure. Obviously, the way you would describe it is this does not apply to homes built in 1978 or later. If the home was built before 78, within 5 days, the seller must provide you a lead-based paint disclosure stating what they know about the possible presence of lead-based paint, any documents they have regarding lead-based paint, and an EPA pamphlet about lead-based paint. You have 10 days from receipt of this disclosure to conduct a risk assessment if lead-based paint is a concern to you. Let's dig into that a little bit. The lead-based paint pamphlet, how many of you hand that to the buyer when you're writing a contract on a 1976 house? Nobody?
I would if I had one, but I haven't had one.
Well, you are required, or it's really your obligation to get that to the buyer. It actually says the seller is supposed to provide it, but I've never received a lead-based paint disclosure with that pamphlet attached. If you do a search for that, the title of that pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, you will find it online. So make sure that your buyer has a copy of that if the home is built prior to 1978. One other thing that's kind of disappointing, that pamphlet is not linked in the buyer advisory, which I found interesting. I think it should be there. I think there should be a link to it in the buyer advisory, because if there were, that requirement that they have that pamphlet would have been already taken care of just by giving them the buyer advisory.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys in Arizona have the same or have issues, but I'm sure if you don't, it might be coming. But here up in Washington, they've talked about like the agency pamphlet, the lead-based paint, the wire fraud, all those. They're saying don't just hand those to the client because it's your word against theirs that you gave it to them. They say always put it in an email with the attachments in the email so you can prove later that you did provide those things. Like, apparently there's been some lawsuits up here where they're claiming that they never got it, and the agent is getting held responsible for not providing them.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Good point there. That's exactly why we have page 13 of the buyer advisory. If you recall, that last page of the buyer advisory in Arizona is simply a place where the seller signs and says that they acknowledge that they got the other 12 pages of it. And up here, you on lead-based paint in the Arizona contract, you're going to check only one of these, either line 173 or 175, obviously, whether the home is built before 1978 or not. And of course, you're going to only initial on one of these lines, the appropriate one for the age of the home. Okay, the next section, 4E, is Affidavit of Disclosure. And simply put, this applies only to properties located outside of incorporated city boundaries. If the property is in an unincorporated area and also not part of a subdivision, the seller is required to provide you an affidavit of disclosure, which contains material information about the property. I don't know, has anybody seen an affidavit of disclosure before? It doesn't sound like you have. Typically,
No, I've never seen it.
yeah. Typically, in fact, specifically, it's designed and required when you're selling non-subdivided land, because subdivided land has a public report. Non-subdivided land requires the affidavit of disclosure, which is really not a lot different than the SPUDs. So that's what you're, and when I say land, there could be a house on the land, of course, but most of the time it's when land transactions are going on. But certainly, if you're inside of an incorporated city, Gilbert, Mesa, whatever, this does not apply at all. And then section 4F, changes during escrow. The seller must notify you of any changes to the property or changes to any disclosures they made. You'll have 5 days to give notice to the seller and that you disapprove of these changes. Pretty simple and straightforward.
Can I add something to that, Mark?
Please do.
So when you do that, and I don't know about Washington and Colorado, but in Arizona, there's an update field in the seller property disclosure. If you're the seller, that's where you can make an update to the seller's property disclosures, or you can use another form that's fairly new in Arizona. It's called notice of disclosure. So either one would work, but whenever there's a change in escrow that's a material fact of the deal, you have to disclose it to the other party.
Thank you, Jeff. That's a good point. That notice of disclosure, I actually just recently learned of that myself, that it even existed. Okay.
Did you see Wes's question too, or on FERPTA?
No.
Says, please remind them This is the seller's responsibility to verify this information, not the title company's legal responsibility.
Thank you very much, Wes. And I did reference a future paragraph in the contract that we're going to address that then as well, I think. So, okay, affidavit of disclosure changes, slide. Okay, 5A, this is the Section 5 warranties section of the contract. And this very first line, I literally say to my buyers, this is just a fancy way of saying the property is being sold as is. Seller agrees to maintain the property in substantially the same condition at closing as at the time of contract. Seller also agrees to remove all personal belongings, including any debris. The seller may agree to do repairs if he requests them, but has no obligation to do any. I think there's a few people here that remember back in the day where there were warranties in a contract and the property was not sold as is. Anybody remember that? No.
Yep, I do.
There are certain parts of certain things were considered to be warranted by the seller if they existed at all, but we changed that a few years back. So, okay, Section 5B, warranties that survive closing. I explain that with the words, seller warrants that they have disclosed every material fact they know about the property, that they've paid in full anyone that has done work or improvements to the property in the 150 days leading up to the closing, and that any statement about the sewer or septic is correct to the best of their knowledge. These warranties by seller, quote, survive closing, meaning that if you discover a problem in these areas after closing, you may be able to make a claim against the seller. Does everybody understand that phrase, that they survive closing, by that statement? Any questions on that?
I do. What are you talking about with the sewer? Are you telling me that if something backs up a week later, I mean, I know I'm in Colorado. I don't know if that's the case, but are you saying that if something backs up, it's the seller's could be their responsibility?
Possibly.
So what would be the option to guarantee have a sewer scope just to, you know what I mean? Clear it out before, you know what I mean? Like,
Absolutely.
How would you protect yourself?
Well, there's actually a section we'll be coming up to in a little bit, Kelly, that that talks about the sewer specifically and in detail. Is it okay if I take care of that question at that point? Because I have it, I think, written down for you. Are you good with that?
Sorry, you don't see me probably. I was shaking my head, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
no, I don't. I'm sorry, I don't see anybody. If I put your images on my screen, it'll cover my slides. So I'm working in the blind. Okay.
Okay, yeah,
So,
bye.
And Mark, the other piece of that, if you go back to that slide, the first part, it has to do with mechanics liens. And the seller is basically promising the buyer that all liens, all work on the property's been paid. Because if that transfers over, the mechanic lien would actually be hitting the seller. I'm sorry, yeah, it would be on the house still. It's attached to the property. So yeah, you're underlining it right. So I'm just saying that's an important part of it is a mechanic's lien and the seller's warranting that they've been paid. All the vendors have been paid.
Okay, yeah, a good explanation. I think there's another paragraph that talks a little bit more about mechanics liens that we'll see in a little bit, Jeff.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
That 150 days, I believe, is a time limit that the mechanics lien is no longer valid after that. I believe that's why that 150 days is in here. And if anybody knows that to be incorrect, please correct me. And obviously I didn't choose to mention mechanics liens, but it often would come up at that point if you're explaining this to the buyer. Okay, buyer warranties. My explanation of this paragraph is that you warrant that you have disclosed any information that may materially affect your ability to close, that you have conducted all inspections and investigations you wanted to prior to closing, and that you are not relying on any verbal information that you received. If you are relying on something verbal, we can put that on lines 211 through 212 right here. So if somebody told them something verbally that they believe should be part of the contract, and you as the agent agree, then we would write it right in there. So it's no longer verbal at that point.
Excuse me.
Go ahead.
So Mark, what?
I'm not hearing you, Lorraine.
You went mute, Lorraine.
Oh, I'm sorry. Have you ever, or anyone here, ever written anything on lines 211 and 212?
I have. I'm not sure I can give you a very specific instance, but I'm certain that I have. Anybody else?
I'm just trying to understand, what would you put there? I'm curious to hear. What
if during the showing the seller happened to be present and said to the buyer that oh gosh, that light fixture we plan to take with us. We don't plan to leave that with the home. That's something you might put in there. Is that a good example?
Yeah, no, we had a listing and the client said, I'm taking my kitchen's faucet. So that could have been there. Or the flagpole that was out in the front yard, would that be placed there?
Yeah, you might want to say, in fact, if it's a basically a quasi fixture, but not really, possibly a flagpole that maybe is in an insert in the ground and not bolted down. You might want to say with the buyer and the seller says, well, I'm going to leave that for you. Then you could put in there that the seller agrees to leave the flagpole. Kind of the reverse of what you were saying, but
Yeah, excellent.
kind
Okay.
of things.
Thanks for explaining.
Oh, you bet. Thanks for helping. Okay, section 6, due diligence. When I get to that section, I usually explain to my buyer what that section's all about by using these words. Due diligence includes anything and everything that you may want to inspect, investigate, or confirm about the property, the HOA, the surrounding area, or anything else that's important to you. And emphasize that all of your due diligence must be completed during your inspection period outlined in the section. Keep in mind that the inspection period is your only opportunity to identify anything unacceptable to you. Notice that I'm using this verbiage not just to explain what the words specifically mean, but to emphasize the things that I believe the buyer should be thinking about. Okay, the next section, 6A, inspection period. I explain it like this. You'll have 10 days, assuming that's the number you choose to put in there, 10 days after contract acceptance to do any and all inspections or investigations that you desire. All inspections and investigations will be at your expense. And this paragraph lists many of the types of inspections or investigations you may want to do. There is virtually no limit. You agree to keep the property free of any liens resulting from your inspections, and the buyer advisory that I gave you will be a great resource. It will help you decide what to investigate and contains many links to where you can find information on each topic. Of course, that's assuming you've already given the buyer the buyer advisory. This should be the latest point in time that you ever give the buyer a buyer advisory. Ideally, they should have it well before you're writing a contract. And by the way, of late, we have not, it's been decided it's pretty acceptable to leave spaces like that just blank in the contract. But there was a day not too long ago when we were expected to put NA or an X or cross out any blank spaces. So there was absolutely, absolutely no confusion as to whether that applied or not. So I tend to do that, but you do not have to. It's not required anymore.
Just a quick question on that. On my where I write a contract, at the very bottom it says autofill NA or none. do you guys have that option? Because it'll autofill NA on the blank spot before I sign.
I don't believe we do. Has anybody seen that on Transaction Desk?
Nope, I have not.
That would be really cool, Kelly. So boom, get it done. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the very first page of the contract that is really that checklist that we give to the buyer, it says right on there in this, the second section of that, it advises the buyer to, quote, investigate any blank spaces, unclear answers, or any other information that is important to you. So putting an NA or a cross through those certainly doesn't hurt, but in Arizona, it's not required. Kelly, in Colorado, is it understood that that's a must, that you should do that in every blank space?
No, it doesn't matter. I get contracts blank or not. I just put it in because I think it looks neater. When you know what I mean? You leave it blank, you don't know, did you mean to leave it blank?
Exactly.
You know? So I like to have it clean. Yeah.
I agree wholeheartedly, but for whatever reason, the powers that be decided that a blank space is just a blank space. It's nothing to worry about. But I like to address every blank space with a line or an NA personally.
Yeah, Mark, in Washington, they it's not required, but
I lost you, Mike.
Hey, Mike, we all lost you, buddy. We can't hear you.
Hey, Mike, if you can hear me, just chime in. I'm going to move ahead until you get your audio taken.
Hey, Mark, yeah, I got it. Thank you. I got to take a phone call here.
Okay, I'm moving on. Section 6B, square footage. I describe that as saying the published square footage of homes and lots is approximate. If the actual square footage of either is really important to you, it's up to you to verify it at your expense during the inspection period. Believe it or not, this can be a really serious issue. In fact, I'll share a story from back in the, I believe it was the early 90s. It didn't happen to me, but it happened to a fellow agent of mine when I was at RE/MAX. They listed a home that the seller stated was, excuse me, in the MLS, the seller stated that the square footage was a certain amount. I think 2,400 square feet. After closing, the buyer discovered that the square footage was actually something like 2,650, so 250 square feet bigger. The buyer sued the seller, the broker, and the agent for the damages of the additional utilities it was going to cost them throughout the future life they were going to live in the home. It was an actual lawsuit that was filed.
This was in the 90s, not today?
This,
huh.
I'm guessing it was like 92 or 93 as I recall. But a paragraph much to this effect appeared shortly after that. So that might have been the catalyst. In fact, many of these disclosures, especially the things that are in all caps and bold print, are the direct result of somebody suing somebody. That's how this contract grows and grows like it does. Okay, section 6C, wood destroying organisms. I never use that term. I describe this paragraph by saying that termites are fairly common in the area. Most lenders do not require you to do a termite inspection anymore, but I always recommend one. If you choose to do one, it must be done during the inspection period at your expense. And I strongly recommend you always encourage a client to do a termite inspection, because you're the one that's going to probably be the bad guy if they find out there's termites after close of escrow, if they've not done one.
Hey, Mark, quick question on that. Maybe I'm wrong, but doesn't FHA and VA loans require termite reports? I might be wrong now.
My understanding that only VA does now.
Okay.
From my experience. And that's why I said most lenders do not require you. I'm pretty sure we've done some FHAs and it wasn't required, but I'm pretty sure VA is the only one.
And we don't have termites in Colorado, and I do VAs, but termites aren't here, so it's not on the, we don't have to do that. So maybe it's different, you know.
Really, you don't have termites there?
We don't have termites. There is nothing to do with well, maybe because we're concrete and siding, not real wood. I don't know. I mean, wood inside our house, but not the outside for them to get in, I guess. I don't know.
Interesting. Well, we've got them here, and I venture to guess about half of the homes that we are involved in transactions on either have or had termites in the past. I've heard somebody say there's two kinds of homes in Arizona, ones that have termites and ones that are going to get them. Okay, right. Section 6D, flood hazard. I described it this way. There are some areas of the valley prone to flooding during extremely heavy rain. Your lender or hazard insurance provider can usually confirm the home is in a floodplain. If it is, your lender may require you to purchase flood insurance. I just describe it simply that way. And does anybody else have any other things that they think might be added there for additional clarification? Good. Okay. Section 6E, insurance. Another one, big, bold, cap letters. Probably somebody got sued over this a while back. Okay, insurance. I recommend you contact your hazard insurance provider for a quote right away. In addition to the floodplain issue, they should be able to tell you if there are any other reasons the property may or may not be insurable or may require a higher premium. Once the inspection period is over, you cannot cancel for inability to get the insurance you want. And then I go on to say your hazard insurance must be in place at close of escrow. The first year's bill is usually paid through escrow. Most lenders add the monthly insurance premium to your payment and use that money to pay the annual insurance premium on your behalf. Most buyers that have bought homes before, you don't have to go into that kind of detail, but you definitely want to make sure they know that it's got to be in place prior to close of escrow. I haven't had any issues where a property was uninsurable, but apparently they do exist. That's part of the reason you want to get the sellers required to provide the insurance claims history. But if you get your buyer on the phone with their hazard insurance company before the end of the inspection period, they'll learn about those things during the time they have to actually back out of the contract or cancel the contract. Okay, we're on, here we go, sewers. Here you go, Kelly. 6F, sewer or wastewater treatment system. I call it sewer and septic. It's very rare, but not unheard of, that the seller believes his property is connected to a sewer system when it's actually not. If there is any doubt, it's up to you to verify, the sewer connection during the inspection period. Obviously, if we know the property has a septic system, we simply say, since this property has a septic system, we have a separate addendum for that. We'll go over in a minute. Then we'll go through the details of that. Another story on this, and Kelly, I think, yeah, if there's any doubt, if you're concerned about whether it's connected to a sewer system or not, you definitely want to get that verified by a licensed plumber, and they can probably do that by scoping the sewer line in the direction from the house to the actual sewer lines, where they usually do both, I believe. I've not ever had a scope done, but I've had buyers on my listings do it. Another little story, this happened to me, I think back in the late 80s. I sold a young couple a home on a 3/4 acre lot in East Mesa in a neighborhood of similar lots and homes where not the buyer that we were buying it from, but the previous buyer, or I'm sorry, not the seller we were buying from, but the previous owner that owned before them shared with the current seller that the city of Mesa had come in and installed sewer lines in the streets. So now the property's on sewer. It used to be on septic, but now it's on septic, but now it's on sewer. So that's what we were told. No more than 3 days after my buyers moved into that house, the septic tank backed up at one of the toilets and made a mess in one of the bathrooms. It turns out that, yes, the city of Mesa did put in the sewer line, and yes, this seller and the seller prior had been paying a sewer bill ever since that date, but it was each individual's homeowner's responsibility to connect their home to the sewer, and the previous owner had never done that. Our seller believed they were connected to sewer, but they were not. They were on septic, and that septic tank just never happened to back up during the time that that seller owned it, but it did on my buyer. That buyer did file a lawsuit. Fortunately, I was not named in the lawsuit, nor my broker, and I honestly don't remember the outcome of it, to be honest.
Jeff's holding up his poop cup.
There you go, Jeff. I wish I could have you guys on here. I'll figure out a way to do that so I can see you all next time we're doing this.
You know, Old Town Gilbert, Old Town Gilbert has a ton of those too. And I was actually praising one in the 90s that was the same situation with the agents that you said, Mark. And we didn't find out until I did the appraisal. So that sucks.
Yeah, and it was the lawsuit that my buyer filed was the damages that they were wanting was the cost of connecting to the sewer, because they bought the home having been told by the seller that it was connected to the sewer. One thing to keep in mind back then, the seller property disclosure statement, that form did not exist. We didn't have it. There was no such thing. But it was the only disclosure that they were relying on was what was stated in the MLS. It said in the MLS it was connected to sewer. Okay, 6G, swimming pool barriers. Oh, I've got this one backwards, my apologies. Here's the contract language down here. There's my explanation. There may be regulations that require you to have certain pool barriers, especially if you have young children, and you are responsible for compliance with these regulations. You are also confirming that you have received the Arizona Department of Pool Safety Notice that I fill in here, that I have here that I'm going to hand you, that I provided you previously, or that I will give you a link to, something, whatever the circumstance is. I can tell you that I don't believe I've ever written a contract, I'm going to confess, with a pool and provided my buyer the Arizona Department of Health Services pool safety notice. Does anybody even know where to get it? Just so you know, there's no link to it or reference to it in the buyer advisory, which I think is another thing that should be in there but is not. I found it simply by Googling the phrase Arizona Department of Health Services approved pool safety notice, and I found it online. So you could provide a link to it online for your buyer, or hand them a printed copy of it, or provide them a PDF that you create yourself. And by the way, the reason I have the buyer's initials required here is simply because these initials are pretty high on the contract, and they're easy to miss. We get a lot of contracts in, and I've missed them too, because you're looking, when you're writing the contract, especially for electronic signatures, you're really focusing on the bottom of each page to do initials, and sometimes these are missed, so be careful about that. Okay, section 6H, buyer acknowledgement. Sometimes I'll, if I have a good rapport with my buyer, I'll say, by the way, this paragraph here basically says you agree not to sue me. You know, just try to be lighthearted about it. But the way I would explain this is, even though I'm a great realtor, I'm not qualified or licensed to conduct due diligence for you. It's very important that you rely only on qualified professionals. You also agree to release myself and my company from liability for any defects that might have been missed during your inspection period. I think that's a good, concise way to explain it. Any thoughts or questions?
I just want to give some comfort to people that are on the phone that are newer in the business. You're not going to know how to explain all this in the first week of your career. This takes years and years to properly be able to explain these things. So don't freak out that you don't know how to explain all this exactly the way Mark is. Just know that we'll support you, and you know, you can put it out to the group or whomever, and you know, and this is a great thing to go back and look at if you have questions from clients on contracts. The truth of it is, in my opinion, and I don't know how Mark feels about this, most of my clients don't really read the contract. They sign the contract. So, but occasionally you'll run across people that actually do.
Yeah, that is true, especially these days. So frequently these days, we're not even in the same room with our buyers when they're signing contracts. They're doing it digitally on their computer from their house. But you know, I come from the old days when you sat down with pieces of paper and you went through this line by line and paragraph by paragraph, and you were kind of expected to be able to explain each of the provisions of the contract, but not so much anymore. By the way, I will be finishing up and completing a handout, hopefully certainly by the end of next week when we do part 3 of this class, that every one of these paragraphs that I'm providing for you will be in writing for you in a PDF that you could print out, and you could literally sit down in front of you as you're talking to the buyer about these paragraphs and literally read it to them if you need to. So that'll be provided to everybody, and only $100 a copy, by the way.
Thank you, Mark.
Only kidding. Okay, 6I, inspection period. Not inspect, but inspection period notice. If you find anything you disapprove of, you must notify the seller in writing before the end of the inspection period in a single notice. Note that this will be your only chance to notify the seller, so everything you disapprove of must be in this notice. Notice I focused on the fact that it has to be done before the inspection period, and this is your only opportunity. I want to just stress that to my buyer. Okay, 6J, buyer disapproval. I explained this section, these first 2 lines, by saying this section describes how we give notice to the seller of items you disapprove of. You have 2 options. Option 1 starts right there in the contract. You can immediately cancel based on your due diligence. I will make sure we complete the notice for cancellation property, so you'll be entitled to a refund of your earnest money. Now you must provide a specific item disapproved of, and that is very important to know. A lot of agents, I think, even believe that the buyer can simply cancel for any reason during the inspection period as long as they do it during the inspection period, but that's not true. The BINSR, if you do a BINSR that says the buyer's canceling the contract, there has to be a reason listed. Now it could be pretty much anything the buyer thinks of, but it must be listed. Any questions on that? Okay, so now we're going to go to option 2. You can ask the seller to complete repairs or otherwise correct items you disapprove of. The seller has 5 days to respond. If the seller is unwilling to correct any of the items you disapprove of, you have the option to move forward and close or cancel and receive a full refund of your earnest money. If you do decide to cancel, you must notify the seller within 5 days of receiving their response, or you will be required to close without the seller correcting any of these items. Any questions on that? Awesome. How are we doing on time? 9:46. Okay, continuing on with this section, lines 285 through 289, the first 2 lines are pretty self-explanatory. You can literally just read what it says right there, easier than I could try to explain it differently. That everything has to be in writing. Nothing verbal counts at all in a real estate transaction. Lines 287 through 289, if we fail to give the seller notice before the end of the inspection period, you will be deemed to have accepted the property and are obligated to proceed. So simply put, if you blow it, if you or the buyer blows it and you fail to give that notice, the buyer just accepted the property as it sits if the inspection period goes by without you giving notice to the seller.
So this is a huge deadline, everybody. This could cost your client a lot of money and blow up a deal, and they'd be very unhappy. So this is one date you want to put out there on the calendar and have multiple reminders that at this date is the end of the inspection period. Because if you don't put anything in, they're accepting the property.
Thanks for that clarification, Jeff.
And same with the seller. If the seller doesn't get back to you, this is something that people tend to forget. If the seller does not respond, that means they're not obligated to fix anything. So if they just don't even respond to you at all, that means they're not agreeing to those requests.
So how would you handle that, Jeff and Mark? Would you
Well,
pick up the phone or send a notice? What would you do before that date is that expiration?
well, if the seller fails to respond within 5 days, at that point, the buyer can issue a cancellation of the contract if they don't respond at all. If they fail to respond within the 5 days, that is deemed they're the same as they're saying, no, we're not going to fix a thing. And at that point, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, that at the end of the 5 days and the seller, at the end of the seller's 5 days, that starts another 5-day period clicking for the buyer to respond to the seller's lack of response and cancel the contract.
That's correct.
So a lack of response on the 5th day by the seller is the same as the seller saying, no, I'm not going to fix anything you asked for. Any questions?
So if that happens then, Mark, then the buyer has 5 days to respond to the seller to say I'm out.
Exactly.
Got it.
Okay. 6K home warranty plan. Simply put, this is where you decide if you would like to have a home warranty plan and also who is going to pay for it. I always strongly encourage the buyer to obtain one, whether they pay for it or they ask the seller to pay for it. All of us should be familiar with at least one or two companies. I really am very happy with Old Republic Home Warranty. I've just heard really good things about them, although I've had Old Republic Home Warranties, but I've never made a claim. I have lots of clients who've made claims and were happy. And I have an AC guy, an old friend of mine, that does primarily home warranty company work. He built his business on doing work with, being one of their approved contractors, and he loves Old Republic. He says they're the easiest ones to deal with, especially with an AC replacement issue. So keep that in mind. But like Holly says, when you're recommending or giving the buyer any type of recommendation, or whether it be a handyman, a home warranty company, or a lender, she says, what's the saying? She says, give more than one, but not the whole phone book, or something like that. So it's not a bad idea to let the buyer know that there are other options out there, but I don't have any problem with sharing that I'm happy with them, a particular company in this case. And if you're not familiar, if you're really new and you really don't know what to advise the buyer here on this number, the amount, I would write in a number between $550 and $600, and you're probably pretty much covered. And then here and here, Old Republic Home Warranty, or whatever the name goes there, and optional coverages, you can write to be determined, and then let the buyer figure that out between contract writing and close of escrow. Any questions or comments?
One of the things I do, Mark, is in my buyer consultation, I get one of these warranty brochures. So whatever warranty company you pick, make sure you get some brochures and you can explain the different coverages, and they can start thinking about that from the very beginning, that's good representation.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're working well and you do a good buyer presentation or buyer consultation up front, the buyer has already been notified and has the resources to choose what home warranty they want. Thanks, Jeff.
Mark, did you say that it's okay, because I was told differently, to put to be determined in the contract in that section?
I do it all the time.
Okay.
What did you hear? Please share.
The broker's training,
Oh, really?
not to put D.
Did they explain why?
I don't have that in my notes here, but I can ask.
Yeah, I can't see an issue there. You might clarify by to be determined or in fact, the actual language that I've been using is to be chosen at buyer's option or at buyer's option.
I like that.
So it's clear that the buyer is the one to determine it, nobody else. Yeah, I'd like to find out what the brokers, why the brokers are saying that, because I don't see what the potential problem is, but they see a lot more issues than I do. Okay, 8 minutes left. All right, 6L, walkthroughs. Notice it's plural. The seller agrees to allow you access to the property to do a walkthrough before closing to confirm any repairs agreed to have been completed and that the property is in essentially the same condition as it is now. And I just add this, that the walkthrough is usually done around 3 days prior to close of escrow, just to let them know kind of what the timeline is on that. And obviously the reason it's plural here is you might have to do more than one walkthrough. For instance, you do your first walkthrough and the seller has not taken care of an issue that they agreed to in the BINSA. So you might have to come back the next day or 2 days later and do it. Any thoughts or questions on that? Okay. 6M, seller's responsibilities regarding inspections and walkthroughs. The seller agrees to allow the walkthrough with reasonable notice and agrees to keep all the utilities on. Pretty simple, very straightforward. Okay, here we are. Wes.
Can I chime in really quick?
You sure may.
So we had a situation where the estimate of the turning off of utilities might be a little bit premature by sellers. So if you're, remind your sellers not to turn off the utilities too soon because it's a real pain in the rear.
Yeah, we did run into that problem. And interestingly enough, what we did is we ended up to do the walkthrough, we hooked the neighbor's outside hose bib up to a hose bib of the house and opened them both so the buyer could check for water flow in certain areas where there's some repairs were supposed to be done. We literally did that in that case. Thanks for sharing that. I forgot about that, Mel. Oops, wrong way. Okay, IRS and FERPTA reporting. This is how I describe it to a buyer. If the seller is a non-US citizen, the law requires that up to 15% of the purchase price is withheld from the proceeds to cover any taxes the seller may owe. The way the law is written, it's the buyer's responsibility to withhold this from the seller. Not to worry, because in reality, at least in Arizona, the title company will process the paperwork and take care of getting the money to the IRS. And the italics here are just for information. That's where I would, I'm telling you guys rather than the buyer that if the purchase price is less than $300,000 and it will be a primary residence for the buyer, the FERPTA regulations don't apply. Nothing needs to be done pertaining to FERPTA. And the buyer has no obligation or responsibility there, as long as $300,000 and it's going to be the new buyer's primary residence. Any questions or comments on that? Wes, do you have anything there?
No, that sounds good. I appreciate it.
Okay. Yeah, it is a weird thing. And the reason it's the buyer's responsibility, the way, because the IRS made it that way, is because the IRS has no leverage with a non-US citizen. So they make it the buyer's responsibility, but it's withheld from the seller's proceeds. And Canadian sellers, well, non-US settlers, we deal with a lot of Canadians, so we've had a lot of experience with this. And they know and expect it to happen, that it's going to happen, and the title company will take care of it. By the way, if you've got a listing with a non-US citizen owner, you absolutely need to go into the, I believe it's the additional, what is the section in ARMLS? Additional, there's a place in there where you can check the box that says FERPTA may apply. And you should also identify in the private remarks in the MLS, if you've got a non-US citizen seller, that FERPTA may apply there. Just make sure that you do everything to ensure that you've notified the buyer and the buyer's agent that the seller is a non-US citizen. Okay, remedies. I'll tell you what, it is now 9:57, and this is probably a good spot to halt, and we can go into the remedies section.